Hello, everyone. This is WGM Sabina Foisor. Very excited to bring you back another round of the 125th edition of the US Open and Invitationals. Mostly, I've been focusing on the Invitationals, so that will be my main area of focus. However, if you find any interesting game that's taking place in the Open, please don't hesitate to let me know, and I'll be sure to check it out so that we can discuss it together. We have passed the half of the competition yesterday with the third round having taken place, and now we're entering into the second half. The players have already started their fourth round, and I'm predicting another thrilling day of competition. And I certainly hope you'll be sticking around to find out how the games unfold. I want to say a special thank you to Precision Tune Auto Care, who are celebrating over 45 years in business, and they're sponsoring the stream for the entire duration of the US Open. So that's quite exciting. Aside from helping us keeping our cars safe on the road, we are also having a smooth transition, hopefully, here on stream. The tournament, the US Open, is taking place in Wisconsin. I am bringing you the action live from my own home, and occasionally you might be able to see my cat Regina, which is going to come cheer the players up for hopefully making good moves. But yesterday, like I said, we had a thrilling competition, so without further ado, I think it's time for me to take you through some of my favorite moments from yesterday's round 3 before we get into the action with today's round. We can also wait, of course, for a few more moves that way, so we don't feel like we're just looking at 2-3 moves. All right, so my favorite moments. Let's get started with the Irwin tournament of senior players. So on board 1, we had international master Stuart Rachels playing against international master Timothy Taylor. And in this specific position, I felt White was doing quite well. They're up a pawn and they just captured this pawn in h5. And all they had to do, in my opinion, is bring the final piece into the game. My suggestion was this move, rook a to d1. Having brought the final piece into the game, it helps White just kind of just trade a bit of pieces and delay black or take black away from potentially having attacking ideas on the king side. In the game, instead, White ended up playing this move bishop f3, which allowed black some activity, and international master Timothy Taylor immediately played the move rook d3, which starts threatening things on the third rank. King f1 was played, and now queen h4. White did play the move queen c4, but here black was ready for a sacrifice. Rook takes f3, and he is definitely ready for it. Pawn takes, and now queen takes h3, king e2, and in my opinion, one of the best moves, maybe even before queen takes h3, this move rook g5 would have brought black definitely the equality, because we're bringing the rook ready to capture e5, making sure that pawn is going to be captured under good circumstance. White's king isn't going to escape that easily, and that pawn would be captured. In the game, queen takes h3 was played first, and then queen f5, which gave White a bit of chances to potentially try to play for a win. I think rook g5 once again would have been the way for black to go in order to be able to get that pawn first and then look into f3. The game continued like this, and in such positions, whenever someone is up on exchange, we want to have under consideration the idea that activity is very important for the rook. That's the only way the rook will really show its superiority towards the minor piece, whether it is a knight or a bishop. So trading a pair of rooks is good. However, the continuation now, because there's so many pawns on the board, I think White has to be super precise. Looking back here with the engine a bit as well, it seems that black can create some kind of fortress by pushing the queenside pawns. So in order to stop everything, b4 followed by maybe a4, a5 would have given white some chances here in the position, though still is very difficult to really predict. I mean, we see this bar here showing that white has decisive advantage when you see +2 or more. We expect that that side supposedly should be winning, but it's still far from winning because black doesn't have really weaknesses that we can really take advantage of. But by doing that, it would have helped stop black from pushing the pawns. White ended up playing the move rook to g8, and then as the game progressed, eventually more pieces got traded and the players ended up getting a draw. The next game that was quite interesting to me was this one of Grandmaster Alexander Fishbein. Once again, has recently been crowned the US Senior Champion last week in St. Louis. And I was a bit surprised by his choice in this specific position. He's definitely having a very comfortable position, much better placed pieces, and ready for the attack on the king side. So I was definitely surprised to see his choice here, bishop d3, instead of what I thought was more natural, bishop h5 with tempo, chasing the rook away, followed by bishop g6. I think it would have given him definitely much easier chances to outplay his opponent. Even bishop d3 maintains some advantage, but it just felt a bit uncomfortable for the bishop for a while. But he's planned to follow up the attack later, developing the bishop first, bringing in both of his rooks on the 4th rank, certainly have made this beautiful game. And if you haven't followed the tournament just yet, be sure to check it out and see it for yourself. It was definitely one to watch for. Going on to another game that I kind of enjoyed was this game that was played in the Denker Tournament of Champions, and this was board 1 between FIDE Master Vishnu Vanapali and International Master Evan Park. This was a game that could have changed the standings quite a bit, but stay tuned to see what exactly happened. So the players follow through this relatively known line of the 4 knights Scotch variation: takes, bishop c5, bishop e3. Bishop c5 is not the most popular, by the way, for black. Usually people go for bishop b4 here, trying to put pressure on e4 indirectly, but Evan chose to go for the move bishop c5, and the next few moves were quite natural. Both players follow through with their development, and it was in this particular moment, after the move bishop g5, f6, bishop to c4, that black decided to move the king to h8, which proved to be a big mistake that could have cost him the game. Instead of this, actually, I believe knight takes would have been the correct choice, and after the capture in the center, bishop e6, black gets to have a relatively solid position here. The king is safe, and maybe the players would end up drawing in the end. But after king h8, white gets the chance to really take the initiative and utilize the fact that black has not yet developed those pieces. So here, knight takes e6, pawn takes, knight takes d5, and after pawn takes g5, knight takes b6. This sequence was perfectly played by FIDE Master Vishnu Vanapali, and after queen takes d2, I was a bit surprised by his choice. Obviously, we can capture both with the king and rook. In my opinion, rook takes would have been a better choice, because by doing so, you are maintaining the rook on the open file and you're getting ready to bring the other one in. Black can recapture the knight with both the A and C pawns. C pawn is probably more natural, but after this, white can continue first maybe with the move rook d6 to restrict or to make black go bishop b7, and now bringing the final piece into the game, followed by rook d7, entering the 7th rank, and I think this is dominating for white. If black would choose to capture with the a pawn instead, then I was looking at this move bishop f7, chase the rook away, followed by rook e1 and rook e7, and white's position is once again dominant. Obviously, you can't take the bishop because of back rank, so that's why white will manage to go rook e7 and have a huge advantage. Vishnu decided to capture with the king, which gave black maybe relatively chances to equalize again. C takes was probably a better choice. A takes b6 was played, however, and after some more moves, the players seemed to be kind of simplifying a bit towards an endgame where black could have had a bit more chances to draw. But the fact that white can create a further away passed pawn on the queen side certainly gives him the better edge in the position, and also his king is much better placed than black's, being stuck in the corner. So this was definitely Vishnu's moment to try to create something. Before was played rook e5. Look at this beautiful activity with the rook c5, rook takes c7. Now actually in this position, I believe before rook takes c7, this in-between move could have certainly helped white, because this allows the opening of the c file, so white keeps the rook open to protect the c2 pawn as soon as that file opens up. Obviously, if you go king there, you can just come back to b3, and we're back to the previous position where we don't need to worry. We just got the bishop from c4 to b3, and after the capture we can take. This is fully covered. Obviously after bishop g8, king h6, we don't have the time to do that, but no cause for alarm, we can still take. And now once again the rook covers c2, and that pawn is very important in making sure that white's position is going to be better. Extra pawn, and then of course the ability to potentially win that pawn and try to outplay black with the passed a pawn. After rook takes c7, pawn takes, white made the final mistake, after which the advantage goes away completely. He ended up capturing the pawn, which allowed his own pawn in c2 to be captured, and after that there's no way for white to really have any more winning chances. Instead, the correct move, which still would have maintained some advantage for white, would have been the move king b2. Hold on to the pawn a bit longer, play bishop b3, and then after that try to go grab the b pawns, at least one of them first. Then the king would get activated and we'll be back to the previous position with some tempos down, but it would still give white some chances. Unfortunately for Vishnu, he captured, and a few moments later the players agreed on a draw. So I'd say quite a bit miss for him. Another one of those positions that I kind of wanted to bring the attention to was from this game of Evelyn Kiao against Rebecca Cortez, which was played on board 3 of the Haring tournament of girls champions. And in this position, if we're evaluating it, we realize black is up a pawn and should not have much trouble trying to improve, but somehow black felt that it was necessary to make some pawn trades. But really the most important thing for black here is bringing the king closer to the game. So had Rebecca played the move king f7, she would have made her life relatively easy, because you know the check doesn't create any issues. Rook f6 to go grab the pawn, the a pawn simply starts marching, and there isn't much that white can do in order to stop that. Rebecca, on the other hand, felt she had to make the trade, but by trading this pawn to the one in c3, she actually ended up helping white get rid of the weakness and make its path to bring the king closer to the center with tempo relatively easy. e6 was played, and now black's king is a bit restricted, cannot go to f7 anymore. And the next few moves were very well played by both players, trying to improve the position. The bishop comes to c3, looking towards the king side, but also stopping the a pawn from advancing. And now it is in this particular position after king e7 that Evelyn played the move bishop b2. She probably felt that she's gotten some kind of restriction and doesn't need to worry too much. Maybe she thought her opponent was going to play king d6, and she could check and be fine in the position. But the truth is that after bishop b2, black is able to activate the rook. All black needed to do is activate the rook, switch the position between the king and the rook so that the rook can actually infiltrate, maybe attack h2, and support those passed pawns that arise. And here, after rook f8, the game is just simply over. And in order for white to really maintain some kind of balance, rook e5 had to be played. This move maintains the pressure on the g pawn and the h pawn. If you go rook g8, then we're going to go bishop d2, putting additional pressure. The king can come in, and this also takes away the rook from attacking the pawn in e6, so black wouldn't really get the chance to outplay white at this point. After bishop b2 and the rook got to f5, the pawns on the 5th rank are protected. The pawn in b5 is relatively weak and hanging, and white never really got the chance to bring the rook on the back rank. It would have been brilliant if she could have, but there's no real way to do that. And with another pawn under her belt, black was able to eventually convert this game and brought home the full win. This endgame was certainly one that we definitely need to talk about. It's one of those endgames that you think you know, but you may need to double check. If you happen to struggle with rook endgames, don't miss the opportunity to occasionally go back and review the important theoretical rook endgames like the Lucena, Philidor, Ventura, Horwitz, and many others that involve rook and pawn versus rook in different situations, so that you know how to outplay the opponent should you find yourself in a situation with an extra pawn, or save the game when you find yourself in a situation with material disadvantage. Here, black found the right approach. Like, obviously, it seems that this pawn is going to be cruising through, but we're still far from that. Black has done something very good, restricting its king, but he needs to do something about his own. It's way too far away from the b pawn, so what we need to do is just break through, trade the final pawn of white, and now we need to focus on how to stop the b pawn. So there are various positions of Chiron's that people have to study in order to know how to get from this to a Lucena or not. So highly recommend checking Chiron out if you haven't done so yet. It's the kind of endgame you really need to know in such a situation. Black seemed to be familiar with some of the ideas, but misplayed it in a bad fashion, and neither him or his opponent kind of realized it. So after rook c2, of course, it's important for white to be able to support the pawn to bring the king up. So we need to untie ourselves. We cannot trade the rooks. The king and pawn endgame is obviously lost. King b2, and now the correct move for black in this position is the move king to f6. You got to remember, 6th rank is the rank where you want to place your king, because from here you have the ability to get on 7th rank, and should you be cut off by white's rook, you will have the ability to uncut yourself with the rook to d8. Another reason why the king stays in f6 is to avoid being cut off both horizontally and vertically by white's rook, and I'm gonna make those lines in a different color just to make sure I emphasize on this as much as I can. The rook in c7 doesn't do that great of a job of cutting off. The king would simply advance and the rook would be chased away. But in this situation, after king f5, white could have played the move rook c6, and yes, this is a terrible cutoff, because if your king advances, you go to d5, b5 protects the rook, and as I mentioned earlier, black's king is restricted and white's king advances. There's no way for black to save this at any point. So king b3 was played in this position by white, missing that opportunity. So of course, immediately, now that you know, please tell me you know which one of these two moves black should play in this position in order to draw. Hopefully you chose the right one. It is king e6 indeed. King e5 was played, however, giving white once again the opportunity to restrict black's king. With b5, the game would be over. So the players kind of had this back and forth for a little bit of time, and white may have been a bit familiar with the idea, but rook c5 should be played only if the king were to be in d4. That way we would have had that double cutoff horizontally and vertically. In this case, we're not really having it. So king d6, this is a theoretical drawing position. Once the king now advances, basically all black has to do is just make sure that it doesn't actually get to b7. If it does, then we will have the Lucena position. So black did perfectly by checking white's king and now playing the move rook to b8, because white does not have the ability to push b5 for obvious reasons, and the king cannot advance for obvious reasons. So white's only way to try to advance here is by playing rook b5. Should white move the rook anywhere, black would start checking, and white doesn't have the ability to hide with the king anywhere other than b3. And then black simply stays with the rook on b8, or can go king d7 to attempt the trading of the rooks, and that endgame is a draw. But after rook b5, black has to be super precise in order to get a draw here. Rook a8 is correct, king b6, and now the correct move had to be played, or else black is in huge trouble. Unfortunately for Reddy, he blundered here. He felt that he could have waited one more move by moving the rook somewhere far on the 8th rank. He did play the move rook f8, but after this it allowed white's king to go to a7, and even if the king approached to check, cut off the king, and now the b-pawn simply marches. Rook f5 is not sufficient to really stop it, and now we're simply getting into Lucena position. If you know it, you know it. He didn't even allow the actual Lucena, he just made sure his king was safe, and now b7, b8 is coming. Going back to that moment where the final blunder was made by black, the correct move in this position for black is the move rook to a4. Placing the rook here keeps white's rook stuck to protecting b4, so the only progress for white is to advance with the king, bring the rook, push the pawn. No cause for alarm. As king b7 is played, we play the move king to d7. Sorry, what did I do? I messed up. My bad. Sorry. Wait, where are we? Not rook a4 yet. Not rook a4 yet. Yeah, this is gonna be Zugzwang, and black is losing. So we need to give one more check. Apologies. One more check. King a6. One more check. King b7. Now we go rook a4. Apologies. Thousands apologies. Rook a4. We keep the pawn under attack. And now, okay, if you go king b6, we don't do this because and white is winning. We go right back, because now, regardless of where the rook moves, we start with the checks once again. So this pattern of going back and forth, realizing when to do it, is very important. So after rook a4, rook b6 check, king d7 is the losing move, because now what happens is white plays b5 and you're in Zugzwang. If you go rook a5, we go king b8, and now if we go back, rook b7, and we don't have any more king moves, and if the rook moves, then white will have the ability to activate their rook, not to play b6, because now rook a6 once again, and it is black that puts whites in zugzwang, but instead we simply activate the rook, and if they attack us, whether a5 or b1, we're able to cover that pawn with the rook, then we can bring the king back to support the pawn and win. So in this particular position, when we are checked, it is very important to play the move king to d5. When we do this, the king comes to c4, attacks the pawn, and there's no way for white to save it. After b5, king c5, and this would be a draw. A tough rook endgame. It's easy to mess up. I almost missed it once, as you saw, but it is very important to be aware of this. If you're struggling with rook endgame, this is one that I actually see even more often than the Philidor these days. So I highly recommend checking out Sharon's positions with the b pawn and just making sure you know your maneuvers in order to be able to outplay your opponent should you be in a situation to do so. And I believe that was probably my final very important position that I wanted to go over with you guys. The last one, which was quite a bit impressive, I gotta say, was the one that happened in the game between Ted Wang and Liam Liu in the Rockefeller section of the Invitationals. In this position that's relatively balanced, surprisingly to me, black decided to play the move king to d7. Must have been really worried about this knight c7 idea. I feel him. I mean, it's not easy to come up with something to do. Obviously, you know, if you castle, this pawn is going to be hanging, and if you look at ideas with sorry, rook c8, you realize there's a check, you realize that's hanging, so you find yourself in a situation that you don't know what needs to be done. King d8 basically does the same as king d7, and then you look at the position and you're like, uh-oh, I think I simply messed up here. I don't think I have any other choice. I'm gonna lose. And I feel you. It's the kind of position that can get one a bit worried, you know, like even taking the pawn doesn't work, and then you just panic and you feel that everything is bad and you're gonna lose. So in such situations, it's tough to really come up with something that will make sense. But in the end, if you took all of those moves and you realize none of them works, then you go for the move rook to d8. You say, okay, fine, I'll give that pawn, but let me at least get something out of the situation. Let me at least try to get the pawn in c4, or if they take, let me at least get some activity with my knight, and eventually I'll find a way to get my pawn back. Instead, black felt that it was important to bring the king towards the center, but this move allowed white to get a lot of initiative, and eventually black's king got mated in the middle of the board. I just wanted to show it for the purpose of a beautiful kind of setup here that Ted was able to bring bishop g4, threatening the capture of the pawn, and after knight e5, he simply played c takes d5, giving up the bishop. That's why I like this, because I think it's kind of a beautifully organized position. All of white's pieces almost are in play. This rook can come into c1 very easily, while black's rooks don't really come into play anytime soon. And now d takes e6 check. Obviously, if you recapture, there's knight c7. King c8 was the best move, but it's really not natural to make that move here for black. Black played the move king c6, but after the nice prophylactic a4, white is threatening various mates, And after knight takes e3, the game was sealed here. Rook d4 mate.